Hello and welcome to Ground Truth, the podcast from Control Risks. This is the place to hear the latest insights on how organizations across the world are optimizing their use of strategic intelligence and becoming more secure across the world. I'm your host, Casper Layton. In this episode, I'm going to be asking what being safe, secure and resilient means for a global organization today, and I'll be hearing the perspective of a senior executive from a global bank and one of Control Risk's leading experts on enterprise security. Typically, matters of safety, security and resilience come into sharpest focus when something goes wrong. At Control Risks, we spend more than 50 years helping organizations reduce such risk. What going wrong looks like is changing, and fast. Enterprise security used to be about cyber, physical security, resilience or crisis management, and typically all sitting in separate functions. As organizations become ever more dependent on technology, suppliers, data, people, and of course AI, these risks are converging. The real challenge for leaders now is to manage them as an interconnected system, not a collection of separate issues. I'm delighted to be joined by a representative of an organization that does just that, with a bit of help from Control Risks. For the last 4 years, Shelley Boland has been the global head of corporate real estate and services for Standard Chartered. Standard Chartered describes itself as a global bank connecting corporate, institutional and affluent clients to a network that offers unique access to sustainable growth opportunities across Asia, Africa and the Middle East. Shelley, thanks so much for joining us. Tell listeners a bit more about your role at Standard Chartered.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invite. So I've been at Standard Chartered for over 11 years now. And as you mentioned, I head up the global function for our corporate real estate and corporate services. This is overseeing the corporate population in terms of offices, branches, data centres. So there's over 1,200 sites around the world. And we operate in circa 54 markets. As you mentioned in the opening, we've got a heavy presence in Africa, Asia, Middle East, Pakistan, but we also offer services to customers throughout Europe as well as the Americas. And the role that our team plays is really to provide those services and facilities that shape every moment, whether you're a colleague that comes into our environments every day, whether you're a client that is banking through our client centres, or whether you're a stakeholder or a guest to our facilities. So end-to-end accountability for those areas across the organisation.
And I'm also joined by James Owen, who's a partner at Control Risks. James leads our digital risks practice globally. James, what do you spend your time helping our clients to achieve?
So most of my time, Casper, is spent helping organizations to manage convergence risk, which is essentially helping them to understand how cyber, operational risk, technology risk, geopolitics all effectively interact with one another and come together, and how disruption can flow through organizations through all of those intersection points. Organizations today rely on a complex network of people, suppliers, data, AI increasingly. So helping organizations to look at security risk at an enterprise level is becoming increasingly critical, rather than looking at risks through a siloed or overly narrow approach.
Understood. Shelley, of course, being safe, secure and resilient is absolutely brand critical for an organization like Standard Chartered. Where does enterprise security begin for you?
Yeah, look, for me, it starts with that leadership accountability. I think that you must have a clear understanding that security and resilience is part of how the bank operates versus reliant on one department, called security. And for us, it's less about the organisational chart, but it's where the work needs to be done. And that's why when you're looking through the emerging risks and the things that we're dealing with on that global landscape now, it has to be an integration of the teams that come together around operations, business continuity, the technology team, the real estate team, and our supply chain, all in service of the clients and the colleagues. As you mentioned, for a bank, trust and our brand and reputation is paramount. And part of that is that confidence that we're taking care of your assets, we're taking care of your investments, we're taking care of our colleagues. And therefore, something like enterprise security has got to be a mindset within the organisation, less about guards and cards and how we actually turn up in that posture every single day.
So James, looking at other organisations that Control Risks work with, What's your sense of how well leaders are managing to make this shift of integrating perhaps the cyber, physical security, resilience, insider risk, third-party risk, bringing all those pieces together in a way that actually becomes that cultural cross-organization function that you have stated is so important?
I mean, I think it's easier said than done. I think a lot of organizations are looking at risk in a much more joined up way than they were before, but I think many are still structurally finding it difficult to do that because it is a difficult aspiration to achieve very, very simply. I think actually financial services is further ahead than most other sectors in this regard, and that's largely because regulation has required banks historically to map their dependencies, their critical services.
Right, everyone's looking at them, right?
Exactly, and ultimately to test more rigorously. So we can see the impact of the way that regulation has supported those efforts there. We ourselves see that, for example, in the work that we do with the regulator in Hong Kong, where last year we ran a typhoon-based scenario for the Hong Kong Banking and Monetary Authority in this city. That was a effort to focus on testing the resilience of the financial services sector, but with a physical security scenario that then played out very much in terms of the cyber, the operational, and the broader financial impact of that on the sector as a whole. And that is a pattern that we see more broadly. It wasn't long ago that we saw, for example, in the United States last year, specifically in Chicago, where the failure of a calling system within a data center had a direct impact on the ability of financial exchanges in the United States to operate. That has a major impact that then follows on in terms of the way that organizations manage their AI-enabled services that were themselves dependent on that data center. So, we see lots of challenges facing organizations. I think financial services is further ahead, but ultimately still many organizations, the escalation points and the ownership is still quite siloed. I think the solution to that, just to preempt a question you might ask me, is not then to create one extra big, gigantic security function. Ultimately, it is to make sure that everyone is looking at the same picture. It is about sharing intelligence and trying to encourage a culture of joining the dots within an organization as a whole, I would say.
And Shelley, how's that experience been for you at Standard Chartered? Because I imagine you've got the typhoon guys, you've got the cybersecurity guys, and that interesting example of the exercise you took people through in Hong Kong last year. How's it been for you bringing these, I suppose, fairly culturally quite disparate parts of the organization together so that they're all, to coin a cliche, singing from the same hymn sheet?
Yeah, and look, we were part of the control risk event there in Hong Kong, and in actual fact, control risk has come in with our senior leaders and run those types of scenarios and really helped us test our response and where we would course correct. So to your point again, it's less about one big security department, and for us, it's that we've got an ecosystem that comes together across all those areas, and so that way we can look at risk from a total perspective. I think the other thing is that you've got to embed risk and security in right from the beginning, in when you're making decisions about which markets to enter, which products and services to launch. And that's where, for example, while we might have good intelligence within the organisation, a partner like Control Risk can come in and can give us that global perspective, blind spots that we might not necessarily have access to, information that could actually pivot some of our decision. So we're not just looking at an ecosystem within Standard Chartered, we're also looking at our peers, as well as the insight and intelligence we can get from outside the organisation so that we can make those better informed decisions. But you're right, it's moving away from what was a traditional guards and cards security function, and it's far more integrated now and fused together as one organisation that comes together, both from a predictive and proactive perspective. So we don't just come together when there's a crisis. The actual secret sauce there is that you're spending time doing that scenario analysis, spending time in the markets and testing those different approaches and responses way earlier from when there is actually something and you're in response mode or you're in reactive mode. So I think that's a part that Standard Chartered does well. And your example was a good one of stress testing up front, where we can, how we would bring together an ecosystem in a lot of different scenarios.
And I imagine all the various security-related functions in a firm can understand in theory why it's a great idea to work together. But in practice, what are some difficulties you encountered in getting different teams to work together? I mean, sure, they all wanted to, but actually being able to do it, it's another thing, isn't it? Yeah,
look, a very simple example is we might have an example where we've got a security incident in the workplace and the mindset could be quite, okay, I'm going to resolve this. But in actual fact, that security incident was in a data center, which then had an ongoing impact around technology, which then we need to consider how we could settle and trade for our clients. So it's bringing in a skills-based workforce that really has that end-to-end mindset where they're thinking about the organisation. It's got a client-first approach. So how is this actually going to impact the end user, the client that we're ultimately servicing? And then it's in some cases combining adjacent functions so that it is more relevant to be working together. One good example is we've brought together a global operations center that deals with all of our incident management, security operations. It sits right next to technology. It sits right next to security, it sits right next to HR, and it comes together then to think about all the people, all the partnerships, and all of the activities that we need to do if we ever needed to trigger, some sort of response or proactively manage that. So that's one real life example within the bank.
And on that technology point, is emerging technology making things easier and harder at the same time?
The answer is yes, absolutely. I think in some ways, and I'll use our example, we're starting to use technologies, whether it's AI-led or autonomous in terms of technology, that is giving us greater insight, greater information, more predictive intelligence, so that then we can make better informed decisions. The flip side of that, it is moving so quickly and it's so integrated, as I said, that sometimes it is hard to keep up. And that's where, for example, control risk is very much part of this process. We're launching a new visitor management system. Now, that may sound very basic, but actually what that does is help us manage the identity of guests and help us to manage their experience through the organisation. But then control risk has been able to come in and consult on that around different areas and technologies that might be able to add value in the event that you needed to trigger some sort of business continuity as a result. But so it's both supportive, but it's hard to stay ahead of the pack.
And James, that bit about all parts of an organization being more and more connected with this emerging technology, that really raises the risk of, well, the word I use would be contagion. You may have a slightly less scary word for it, but really it's that piece about if a problem emerges somewhere, a risk starts to impact one part of the company pretty quickly. It starts to wash up on the shores of another department and can leapfrog and grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think contagion risk might be an apt term. I probably use more cascading risk. Right. And we've seen that, I think, for a long time, particularly in cyber. So we're almost now 10 years away from the big WannaCry and NotPetya attacks, which were the first, I think, introduction to the general public around the idea that a cyber attack can move seamlessly across national borders, across organizations and sectors. I think the challenge today is that the density of connections has significantly increased and gone beyond where we were certainly 10 years ago and even just 5 years ago. Technology infrastructure, suppliers, data flows, and business processes are today so interdependent that actually, again, weakness in one part of the system can actually flow through into another part very quickly. So a physical event can become a digital event rapidly, likewise, vice versa. So a power or water outage or a cut undersea cable can create big challenges if you're running a data center. Likewise, a cyber attack on a production unit can cause significant physical, real-world consequences. And we have seen that absolutely now, that transition from cyber to kind of kinetic impact in the digital world. I think what AI is doing, it's effectively intensifying the convergence that we're seeing here, because AI depends on and cuts across all of these systems, all of these connections, which makes it challenging then when the board asks the question, so what is our AI risk? Because they will get a different answer depending on who they're talking to, typically within the organization. A chief information security officer, a chief security officer, a head of risk, a head of government relations will all have a slightly different perspective on that AI risk and what it is. And therefore the board, as a result of that, will be dealing with information more in fragments than based on a kind of joined up, coherent overview of what that risk looks like as a whole. And I think that does talk to the need to look at AI risk less as a special category and more just as another risk, but one that cuts across the organization as a whole, where you need to understand what is your AI workflow dependent on, what can it access, what can it trigger as a process within your organization, and get across those types of organizations before worrying too much about looking at it in any one spot. So I guess looking at the overall risk, including AI, at that operational model level, as opposed to simply as a technology issue.
And maybe be slightly additive. The other one now that we're organizations' operating models are in a lot of partnerships is this third-party risk. And what we're doing then with the whole ecosystem when you're looking at supply chain. So to your point, there may be a downstream impact, but because of the nature of your operations on how we service colleagues and clients, it has a direct impact on our ability to recover the business or deliver those priority services. So I think, again, at that top level of the organisation now, they want to see that end-to-end risk profile. And then you've got these new emerging areas, such as AI, such as third party, that is naturally coming to the forefront because of the changing nature of these, the way we're able to run these global systems. But it's becoming more and more of a priority at that top table, which is a positive.
Yeah. I mean, talking of a top table, and the tenor of this conversation so far seems to me to be still very much around security stopping bad stuff happening. And I know something that security directors, for example, have struggled with historically is being something more than a cost center, something more than a blocker to the organization. You can't do that. You can't do that because that'll happen. Where are we, maybe I'll come to you first in this change, where are we on that journey of being able to sell in enterprise security to senior leadership as an enabler, as something that will actually promote growth rather than just stop the flood?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is really critical, quite obviously, and it talks to the need to ensure that security is both visible but also seamlessly embedded within the culture of the organization. In my view, I think resilience really starts with a simple philosophy: if you see something, say something. And that is on everyone in the organization to work with in terms of kind of sending through those early warning signals to a business where it isn't always needed to rely on the crisis or security teams to do that. So that's about building a culture that encourages people to speak out, to say something if they spot, for example, unusual supplier behavior, or if there is an unexpected result from an AI tool. Speak out, but that requires an organization to empower people and for people to know that they will be heard. The opposite to that is obviously where they don't think that they'll be heard, and the organization will be all the weaker because of that. So I think that kind of importance around building culture where security is both visible but also embedded is really critical.
Are you getting people speaking up at Standard Chartered?
Yeah, look, I mean, it goes back to my culture point. We're an organisation that, culture is absolutely in the centre of this. And, through our operational excellence program that we run, it's that mantra: see it, own it, solve it. And we also then want an organisation where people feel comfortable to use their judgment, they can speak up earlier, but also then they have a sense of responsibility and they're accountable. And so that's why it also goes back to your earlier question, is it's that mindset when you're looking at the skills profile to bring in the organisation. It's everyone from the frontline teams that are dealing with customers every day, but it's also right through to our leadership team that feel like this is the DNA in the organisation. Not to hinder, but if you get the timing around the predictive and the proactive approach, there'll be a number of examples that show actually the speed to market is a lot less by doing that upfront due diligence. Especially if I reflect on Standard Charter, we are in some of the most diverse markets around the world, particularly with a strong presence in Asia, Africa and Middle East. We have to do that upfront due diligence and think about the what if scenario. We're not going to get it right. There's things happening now that I could never have predicted. But I think that then shows that the bank's willingness to think about those elements so that we can support the business as we go into those markets, develop those products or launch those services. But it's got to come from the culture.
So a lot of this is about people within Standard Chartered making the change, being proactive, adopting new ways of working. How do the clients experience this new security posture?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Do you want a client to have something that's quite visible, or do you want a client as part of their journey for it to be integrated? I think it needs to be both. If I look at the Standard Charter footprint, as I mentioned, how we operate and support our clients in a secure and confident way in our markets in Africa versus Asia versus Europe is very different. So we need to be able to flex and localize. A client should not need to understand every control that is behind their visit or their interaction, but they do need to make sure that that experience is something that differentiates us from service. It continues to build trust with the organisation. And in many cases, some of the more diverse locations, we do want a physical posture there. We do want a physical representation of security, and that gives people confidence. But I would say for our clients, we are going to demonstrate that it's integral to their experience and part of our DNA through how we show up and how we perform. And that's really what matters, that sentiment to our customers.
James, have you seen this in other types of organizations that Control Risk has worked with?
So Control Risk, just because of our DNA as a company and what we do, we often see a lot of organizations operate under a lot of pressure and stress, often in the midst of a crisis. And I think trust for an organization with its customer is earned best when they manage that crisis or that situation effectively, where they are clear in their communication, where the customer doesn't see the underlying controls and methodologies that underpin that response to whatever the issue may be, but where they continue to receive a seamless service, where the critical services of the organization remain intact. So I think that trust is best seen often when an organization is under pressure or in the midst of a crisis. That is where an organization gets to execute against the escalation routes that it's defined, the response plans that it's tested most effectively, and where all of that preparation effectively gets executed, and where their reputation integrity, even if actually it's been a damaging issue that they've been running through, actually is maintained ultimately with their clients or customer.
Yeah, and of course, by that point, the whole issue has been taken up and out of security functions, and it's the CEO who's on the line there, and it's critical for the entire organization. I'm wondering, obviously, we've been talking about a rapidly changing situation. We're not at a point where anything's standing still. In 5 years' time, and then you both got good answers for this, what do you think organizations that are getting most of this right most of the time will be doing that will mean that they're still resilient, safe and secure for the future?
Well, look, 5 years' time, there's probably some core ingredients that you should have, depending on what environment we're in. I think back to the earlier point is that you should treat resilience as a strategic capability, and that this is not just a response function, and therefore it is something that, you engage when something's gone wrong, and that you're part of that strategic advice right from the beginning. It's a thought process in the decisions you're making throughout the organisation, not just you need a good crisis to sort of prove that that team really is a value add. So it's hard because they're often the unsung heroes. In many cases, it's what we manage to avoid is going to really give us the edge. But this response function, they'll have clear ownership, will have much stronger data and intelligence, I think, particularly through some of the emerging technology. We will be in a hybrid model. We'll use more partnerships, such as a control risk that can bring in the outside as well as augment the insight that we have. You'll have an integrated team, so it won't just be, 4 or 5 different departments. And it will be a client-centric. Our clients in 5 years' time are going to be dealing with the financial services environment that's going to look very different. So it's going to need to be led by those client needs, and then how we can respond to those client needs in a timely and relevant manner. So those would be the few things that I'd be thinking about if I was looking to put this organisation together in the next few years.
Great. And James, horizon scanning is a thing we like to talk about, a lot of control risks. I'm suggesting your answer might include that expression.
Possibly, Casper. I'll try and avoid using it now.
It's a good one.
It is a good one.
It is a good one. I mean, I would echo everything Shelley has just said, and particularly around looking at resilience as a strategic thing for the organisation. I'd probably emphasise 2 key points. I think organisations who will be successful in 5 years' time will be across the kinds of dependencies they have in the organisation, whether that's technology, people, data, critical services. They'll know where their dependencies are, and they'll know how to respond to issues or risks that start to cascade across them from a disruption point of view in a more joined up and coherent way than perhaps they do now, to echo a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in this session. And I think the other main area is organizations who will be successful will be managing their concentration risk a lot more effectively. So when you think about AI, cloud, digital infrastructure, all of this is highly concentrated in the hands of a very small, highly concentrated group of providers. Managing that concentration risk, I think, moving forward from a resilience point of view, is not just about protection. It's also about choice. It's about the choices that you make as an organization. In some cases, you may not need to switch provider or large language model, for example, but in some cases you may need to. And the organizations that are able to switch provider, to isolate a dependency where there is an issue, I think will be more successful than the ones who are very much aligned to a singular way of working or a singular route where they have little option but to stick with the same provider. So I think managing that dependency risk and that concentration risk is going to be a real marker of success in the future for organizations.
There we are. So that's about all we've got time for in this conversation. Shelley Boland, Head of Corporate Real Estate and Services at Standard Chartered, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences at Standard Chartered. It's been really interesting to hear what you've achieved and will go on to achieve at Standard Chartered. And James Owen, thank you so much for taking part in this edition of The Grand Truth. And thank you all for listening and watching, however you consume the podcast. I will be back in just under a month from now. Do join us then. Bye for now.